It was the second week of October 1990. One of those high gold autumns on the Colorado Front Range, when the cottonwoods turn all at once and the smell of wood smoke drifts down out of the foothills into the quiet streets of Verdun. Holly Brennan was 23 years old in the first October of her first real job, teaching second grade at the elementary school 6 blocks from the little apartment she had just moved into on her own. She had spent that evening the way she spent most of them, grading spelling tests at her kitchen table with the radio on, the children's crayon drawings taped all over her refrigerator door. She called her mother a little after 8, the way she did, and said the new apartment was finally starting to feel like home. She checked the chain on her door before bed, because she always checked the chain. She was a careful girl. None of it was enough. By the time the sun came up over Verdun the next morning, Holly Brennan was gone, and the man who took her would walk free and unknown for the next 33 years. This is the story of how a single thread of evidence, kept in a freezer for 3 decades, finally reached into the dark and pulled his face into the light. But before we get to the morning his name was spoken aloud, you have to understand who Holly Brennan was. Verdun, Colorado, in 1990, was not a small town in the old sense, not a place of dirt lanes and mill whistles. It was a young suburb, a few thousand families spread out at the foot of the mountains in tidy subdivisions and low apartment complexes, the kind of place people moved to precisely because it felt safe. The mall had just put in a food court. Minivans were starting to replace the station wagons in the church lots. People had answering machines and cordless phones, and the evening news came on at 6, and nobody in Verdun locked their cars. It was a town built on the quiet promise that nothing bad happened there. Holly had grown up 2 hours north and come to Verdun for the teaching job, and she had thrown herself into it the way only a first-year teacher can. She kept a glass jar of gold star stickers on her desk and gave them out for kindness as often as for right answers. On cold mornings, she brought a thermos of cocoa and poured little cups for the children whose families couldn't always manage breakfast. She stayed late to laminate name tags and cut out construction paper leaves for the bulletin board. She was the youngest of 2 sisters, and her little sister, Beth, just 12 that fall, idolized her, saved her allowance to mail her hand-drawn cards, counted the days until Christmas break when Holly would come home. Every Sunday night, without fail, Holly called home, and her mother could set her watch by it. She had her habits, the small ones that tell you who a person really was. She wrote her students' names on every drawing they gave her, and dated them, and taped them to her refrigerator until it disappeared under a quilt of crayon. She kept a running list on the counter of things she wanted for the apartment: a real couch, a coat of yellow paint, a dog once the lease allowed it, and she checked the chain on her door every single night, twice, because she was a young woman living alone for the first time, and her father had taught her to be careful. She did everything right. That is a thing her family would have to live with. On the evening of October the 11th, 1990, Holly graded papers, called her mother at 8, and told her she loved her. She set out her clothes for the next morning and put the cocoa thermos by the door so she wouldn't forget it. That was the last ordinary evening of her life, and the last anyone would ever be able to account for. What happened that night happened behind a locked door, in a quiet building, in a town where nothing bad happened, and for a long time the only certainty anyone had was that it had happened at all. Holly did not arrive at school the next morning. By 9, her classroom of second graders sat with a confused substitute. Holly was never late, never absent, never the kind of teacher who left 20 children waiting. The school secretary called the apartment and got no answer. She called again at 10. By 11, the principal had phoned Holly's parents 2 hours north, and her father was already in the car. It was a neighbor and the apartment manager who finally opened the door that afternoon. The details of what they found were never released to spare the family, and they will not be repeated here. What matters is this. Holly Brennan had been attacked in her own home by someone who got past the chain she always checked, and she had not had a chance. The police came. The town that believed nothing bad happened there learned, in a single October afternoon, that it had been wrong. Word moved up and down the block by evening. Mothers who had let their children walk to school alone that morning drove them the next. Detective Tom Garrity caught the case, and he would carry it for the rest of his working life. In those first days, the investigation gathered what it could. There were no signs the door had been forced, which told Garrity the man had either talked his way in or slipped in earlier and waited. There was biological evidence left behind by the attacker, which the crime lab carefully collected and preserved, though in 1990 the science to do much with it barely existed. A young lab technician sealed it, labeled it, and placed it in a freezer, doing her small, careful part for a future no one in that room could picture. And there was one thread, reported by another resident of the complex, and written down in Garrity's own notes. In the days before the murder, a man in coveralls had been seen in the building and the parking lot, a repairman of some kind, with a white panel van. No one had thought anything of it. Repairmen came and went. The lead was noted, and then it dissolved, because there was no company name anyone could remember and no van anyone could trace. Garrity underlined it twice anyway. Something about it stayed with him for 30 years. Detective Tom Garrity ran every lead a 1990 detective could run. He looked hard at the men in Holly's life first, the way investigators do. There was a young man she had dated briefly after moving to town, and for 2 weeks the whole weight of the case pressed on him, until phone records and a coworker placed him 40 miles away the entire night. There was a neighbor with a record who turned out to have been in the county jail on an unrelated charge. One by one, the people who knew Holly were cleared, and that left Garrity staring at the worst possibility of all. Whoever did this had no connection to her at all. He was a stranger. He had come out of nowhere, and he had gone back into nowhere, and he had left behind only a sample of himself that the technology of the day could not read. While Garrity worked the official side, the Brennans lived the other one. Holly's father took a leave from his job and drove the 2 hours down to Verdun again and again. Sitting in motel rooms with a legal pad, writing down questions for a detective who had no answers to give him. Her mother could not enter the apartment, could not pack the little kitchen with the crayon drawings still on the refrigerator. So neighbors and other teachers did it for her, folding her daughter's life into boxes. The children in Holly's class were told only that their teacher had gone away, and some of them left gold star stickers on the school fence for weeks. The town held a vigil. The candles burned down, and the casseroles stopped, and still there was no one to accuse and nothing to do with the anger except carry it. That was the institutional tragedy of Holly's case, and it was no one's fault and everyone's grief. The evidence that would one day name her killer was sitting in an evidence freezer the whole time. In 1990, there was no national DNA database to compare it to. And even when one was built, in the years that followed, it could only catch a man if he was already in the system, arrested for something. Swabbed, entered, Holly's killer never was. He stayed out of trouble. He stayed in the shadows. And a profile of him sat frozen in the dark, year after year, a name waiting for a way to be read. The Brennans lived inside that silence for 33 years. Holly's mother kept the answering machine tape with her daughter's last Sunday call on it and could not bring herself to play it or erase it. It sat in a drawer in the kitchen for the rest of her life, a half-minute of a young woman saying she loved her mother, too precious to hear and too precious to lose. Her father aged a decade in a year. He kept Holly's list, the one from her apartment counter, the couch and the yellow paint and the dog, folded in his wallet, and he carried it until it wore soft at the creases. Beth, the little sister who had idolized Holly at 12, grew up under the long shadow of an unanswered question, and she carried her sister with her into adulthood, eventually becoming a teacher herself, in a classroom not unlike the one Holly never came back to. She kept a jar of gold stars on her own desk. Her students never knew why. Every October the family marked the day quietly, and every October there was no one to be angry at, no face to put to the grief, only a blank where a person should be. That, the family would say, was the particular cruelty of an unsolved case. Other families could hate someone, could picture a courtroom, could imagine an ending. The Brennans had nothing to aim their grief at but empty air. The town of Verdun, meanwhile, grew up and moved on. The apartment complex was renovated and renamed. New families moved into the unit where it happened, most of them never knowing. The elementary school got a new sign and a new generation of teachers. The promise the suburb had been built on, that nothing bad happened there, quietly reassembled itself, because forgetting is easier than remembering. Detective Tom Garrity retired in 2004, but he did not let go. He kept a copy of the file at home, in a drawer in his garage. Twice over the years, as DNA technology improved, he had the evidence retested and resubmitted to the national database, hoping the man had finally been arrested somewhere and swabbed. Twice the answer came back the same. No match. He told Beth more than once that he intended to know that man's name before he died. Every case like this one represents weeks of work, of pulling decades-old evidence, tracing families, and sitting with the people who have waited a lifetime for an answer. If you want this channel to keep finding these stories and giving them the care they deserve, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what keeps these cases from staying in the dark. Now, let's get back to Holly. In the spring of 2022, Holly Brennan's case landed on the desk of a cold case detective named Alicia Rohn, and Rohn had a tool that Tom Garrity never had. It is called forensic genetic genealogy, and it works on a simple, almost unsettling idea. For 33 years, investigators had only been able to ask one question of the evidence. Does this man's DNA already sit in a database of known criminals? The answer had always been no. Genetic genealogy asks a different question entirely. It uploads the unknown profile to the same kind of public ancestry databases where ordinary people search for distant cousins, and instead of looking for the man himself, it looks for his relatives, his second and third cousins, the people who never committed any crime at all. Then a genealogist builds the family trees those matches belong to, downward and inward, narrowing branch by branch, until only one person could possibly fit. The killer does not have to be in any database. He only has to have a cousin who is curious about their heritage. Rohn sent the frozen profile to a genealogist named Paul Devereaux, and over the course of several months, he built a tree out of a handful of distant matches, hundreds of names wide, until it came down to a single family, and then to a single household, and then to one man. It was painstaking work, the opposite of a sudden break. Devereaux spent his nights in old census records and obituaries and marriage licenses, connecting strangers to strangers, watching the tree narrow generation by generation, the way a photograph slowly sharpens in a developing tray. 2 branches, then one set of brothers. Then, by working out who had been the right age and in the right place in 1990, one name. On a morning in the late summer of 2022, Devereaux called Roan with it. Roan sat with it for a long moment before she picked up the phone to call the original detective. After 33 years, the shadow had a name. The name was Dennis Hale. To understand why his unmasking landed the way it did, you have to understand how completely ordinary Dennis Hale had been. In 1990, he was 28 years old, an appliance and refrigeration repairman who worked for a contractor that serviced apartment complexes across the Front Range, including Holly's. Investigators confirmed it from old work orders that had survived in a warehouse. A unit in Holly's building had logged a service call that week. That was the white van. That was the man in coveralls no one thought twice about. He had been in that building for a perfectly legitimate reason, and it was very likely how he chose her, and no one had ever connected a routine repair visit to a murder. And then he had simply moved on. Within a year, Dennis Hale left Colorado. He settled in a quiet suburb of Phoenix, married, raised 2 children, and worked the same trade for 30 years. By every account investigators could gather, he coached a little league team. He had grandchildren. He went to church. He never had so much as a serious traffic ticket, which is exactly why his DNA never entered a database and why he was never, for one single day, a suspect. The most chilling thing about Dennis Hale was how unremarkable his life had been. He had not fled or hidden in any dramatic way. He had simply walked back into the ordinary world and lived in it, in plain sight, for the rest of his days. Because here is the hard ending that no amount of science could change. Dennis Hale died of a heart attack in 2011, 11 years before his name was ever spoken in connection with Holly Brennan. He was never arrested. He never stood trial. He never spent a night in a cell or answered a single question. Investigators confirmed the match beyond any doubt by obtaining a DNA sample from one of his close relatives, and the probability left no room for another explanation. But the man himself had been beyond the reach of any court for over a decade. There would be no confession. There would be no sentence. There would only be the answer. And the answer, it turned out, belonged to more than one family. When Holly's profile was finally read, it was also compared against other unsolved cases, and it matched an attack on a young woman 2 states away in 1988, a case that had sat just as cold and just as silent. Dennis Hale had not struck only once. The shadow had moved through more than one town. In the years he drifted between contracting jobs, and no one had ever linked the cases because no one had ever had his name. His unmasking gave a second family, who had also waited decades, the same terrible gift Holly's family received, a name at last, and the end of wondering. Investigators believe there may be others, and quietly, in 2 states, detectives have begun pulling old files to see what else this one frozen profile might finally answer. There was another set of people who learned the truth in 2022, and it is worth pausing on them. Dennis Hale's own children and grandchildren, who had loved an ordinary man, a coach, a churchgoer, were told what the science had found. They had no part in it and no knowledge of it, and they lost a version of their father and grandfather in a single phone call. It is one of the strange cruelties of these late solves. The truth, when it finally arrives, lands on the innocent too, on people who simply shared a name and a dinner table with a man who kept a monstrous secret folded inside an unremarkable life. Holly Brennan was 23 years old. She kept a jar of gold stars on her desk and gave them out for kindness. She poured cups of cocoa on cold mornings for the children who came to school hungry. She called her mother every Sunday night and said she loved her, and on the last night of her life, she did exactly that. She had a list on her counter of all the ordinary things she was looking forward to. A real couch, a coat of yellow paint, a dog when the lease allowed it. She did everything right. She checked the chain twice. The cruelty of her death was never anything she invited or could have prevented. It came out of the dark, from a man the world considered harmless, and it took a future that was entirely hers. Her family will tell you the answer did not feel the way they once imagined it would. There was no one to face in a courtroom, no one to watch be led away. Holly's mother had passed before the name was found. Her father heard it as an old man. But Beth was there, the little sister grown into a teacher herself, and she has said that knowing was still better than the not knowing that had hollowed out her family for 33 years. And Tom Garrity, 81 years old and long retired, got the thing he had promised her he would get. He learned the man's name before he died. He said it was the only case that ever followed him home, and that he could finally set it down. Holly's case has since become a model for how the oldest, coldest cases can still be solved, and how a sample frozen in 1990 by a careful lab tech can wait 3 decades for a science that hadn't been imagined yet. Dennis Hale escaped every punishment a court could have given him. He lived a long, comfortable, unbothered life and died in his own bed. But his name is attached now, permanently and publicly, to what he did in the shadows, and the shadow itself is gone. The dark that hid him for 33 years does not hide him anymore. I'd like to know what you think. Dennis Hale died free, never arrested, never tried, having lived a full life as a coach and a grandfather. When the only thing justice can deliver is a name, is that justice at all, or only the truth? What disturbs you more, the murder itself, or the 30 years he spent living an ordinary, blameless-looking life 2 states away? And how many men are out there right now who believe, as he surely did, that the years have buried what they did for good, not knowing that a distant cousin's curiosity could one day pull them into the light? Dina unmasked the man who took Holly Brennan after 33 years in the shadows and gave her family and her old detective the answer they had waited a lifetime for. Stories like hers are why this channel exists, and why we believe the truth is worth pursuing no matter how deep into the dark it has gone. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case, and you'll find more solved cold cases waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.